The year is 1942. The North Atlantic is a graveyard, cold, gray, and unforgiving. Deep beneath the waves, a predator is hunting. This is the world of U-boat commander Eric Topp, a man with ice in his veins and more than 100,000 tons of Allied shipping already to his name. He is an ace, a knight of the deep. His boat, U-552, the Red Devil, is a state-of-the-art killing machine. For days, they have stalked Convoy on 127. Patience is the key. You don't rush the kill. You wait for the perfect moment, for the fat, slow merchantman to stray from the herd. Tonight is that night. The sea is calm, the moon obscured by a thin veil of cloud. Perfect conditions. Top is at the periscope, the rubber eyepiece pressed hard against his face. The smell of diesel, unwashed bodies, and stale cabbage thicken the air. This is the scent of victory. Through the lens he sees it. A lone straggler. A 6,000-ton freighter, probably loaded with enough food to feed a small city, or enough steel to build 1,000 tanks. Its silhouette is a dark, hard shape against the slightly less dark sky. A perfect target. He barks orders. The crew, a well-oiled machine of trained killers, moves with silent efficiency. The outer doors of the torpedo tubes are opened. Gyros are set. The calculating officer calls out the range, the bearing, the speed. It's a textbook shot. A shot Top has made 100 times before. But then, something strange happens. Something impossible. As he keeps the crosshairs trained on the center of the ship's hull, the ship begins to change. It's not moving erratically. It's not a trick of the light. The hard, black silhouette starts to soften. The edges blur. The ship seems to be dissolving, melting into the gray twilight. One moment it's a solid steel target. The next, it's a faint, ethereal ghost. Top blinks, wipes the lens. Still, the ship is fading. It's as if the sea and sky are swallowing it whole. His first thought, a new type of smokescreen? But there's no smoke. A trick of the eye? Fatigue? In this deadly game, you can't afford to hesitate. You trust your instruments and your instincts. But what do when they both scream that what you're seeing is impossible? The target is now barely visible, a smudge against the horizon. He can still make it out, just. He makes a decision. Rohr eins los! Tube 1, fire! The U-boat shudders as compressed air violently expels a 1.5-ton torpedo. The crew starts the stopwatch. They listen. They wait for the satisfying crump of an explosion, the sound of tearing metal that means another victory for the Reich. The seconds tick by. 10, 20, 30. Nothing. A clean miss. How? The calculations were perfect. The target was slow. It was a guaranteed kill. But the ghost ship sails on, seemingly unaware, swallowed by the gloom. On the bridge of U-552, there is only stunned silence. Top lowers the periscope, his mind racing. What did he just see? Was it a weapon? A new technology? Or was the Atlantic finally making him go mad? He had no way of knowing it yet, but he had just become one of the first victims of one of the most bizarre, counterintuitive, and brilliant ideas of the entire war. An idea born not in an engineer's workshop, but in the mind of a painter and a zoologist. An idea to make ships invisible. To understand the sheer desperation that led to painting ships pink, you have to understand the terror of the Battle of the Atlantic. It wasn't a single battle. It was the longest, most continuous military campaign of the entire war, running from 1939 to 1945. And for the first few years, Britain was losing. Badly. Prime Minister Winston Churchill would later write, "The only thing that ever really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril." He wasn't exaggerating. Everything Britain needed to survive and to fight came by sea. Food, fuel, iron ore, bauxite for aircraft, tanks from America, ammunition, troops. Every single bullet, every single gallon of gasoline had to cross the Atlantic Ocean. And waiting in that ocean were the wolf packs, the German U-boats under the command of Admiral Karl Dönitz. Dönitz was a master strategist. He understood that this was a war of tonnage. It wasn't about glorious naval battles between battleships. It was a slow, grinding, brutal war of attrition. Sink more ships than the Allies could build, and Britain would starve. The island nation would be forced to its knees without a single German soldier landing on its shores. And in 1942, his plan was working devastatingly well. This period was known to the U-boat crews as the Second Happy Time. German submarines, operating from bases on the French coast, could range far out into the Atlantic, far beyond the reach of protective Allied air cover. They hunted in packs, communicating by radio. A single U-boat would spot a convoy, shadow it, and then call in the rest of the pack. They would attack at night, on the surface, where they were faster and harder to detect by the primitive sonar, or ASDIC of the day. The results were catastrophic. In the first 6 months of 1942 alone, U-boats sank over 3 million tons of shipping. That's more than 500 ships sent to the bottom of the ocean. 500 ships, carrying vital supplies and thousands of merchant seamen who stood little chance of survival in the freezing Atlantic waters. The convoys were protected, of course, by Royal Navy and Royal Canadian Navy escort vessels, corvettes, frigates, destroyers. These ships were crewed by brave men, but they were hopelessly outnumbered and outgunned. A typical convoy might have 50 or 60 merchant ships spread out over miles of ocean, protected by a mere half-dozen escorts. It was like trying to guard a flock of sheep with a handful of sheepdogs against 100 wolves. The escorts would race back and forth, dropping depth charges, hunting for the submerged U-boats with their ASDIC. But it was a desperate, defensive battle. The U-boats could pick and choose their targets, strike, and then slip away into the depths. The losses were unsustainable. Britain was on a knife's edge. The Admiralty's brightest minds were working around the clock, trying to find a solution. They needed more escorts, more long-range aircraft, better radar, better weapons. But all of that took time. Time to build, time to train, time to deploy. And time was the one thing they were running out of. They needed a solution, and they needed it now. Any idea, no matter how strange, no matter how unorthodox, was on the table. The very survival of the nation depended on it. It was in this atmosphere of crisis and desperation that someone remembered the strange experiments from the First World War and began to wonder, what if we can't sink the U-boats? What if, instead, we could just make the ships disappear? The idea of hiding a ship at sea wasn't new. During the First World War, a British marine artist named Norman Wilkinson had pioneered a radical concept called dazzle camouflage. The goal of dazzle wasn't to hide the ship. Hiding a massive, smoke-belching steel vessel in the middle of a flat ocean was considered impossible. Instead, dazzle camouflage aimed to confuse. Ships were painted in a wild array of bold, contrasting stripes, curves, and geometric shapes. The idea was to make it incredibly difficult for a German U-boat commander, peering through a periscope, to judge the ship's course, its speed, and its range. Was the ship turning towards him or away? How fast was it going? By the time the U-boat captain figured it out, his torpedo, which had to be aimed at where the ship was going to be, would likely miss. It was a brilliant piece of applied cubist art, and it had some success. But by the Second World War, technology had moved on. Periscopes had better optics, rangefinders were more accurate, and more importantly, the nature of the threat had changed. Dazzle was designed for daylight engagements, but Dönitz's wolf packs preferred to attack at night, on the surface. And at night, against a dimly lit sky, even the most crazily painted ship was still just one thing: a solid, black silhouette. Dazzle did nothing to break up that silhouette. It was a black shape, easily visible from miles away. The Admiralty knew this. They tried various schemes, painting ships in different shades of gray, blue, and white, hoping to find a color that would blend in with the sea or the sky. But nothing really worked. The problem was fundamental physics. An object, no matter what color you paint it, will look dark when it's in shadow. A ship's hull is a massive vertical surface. The light from the sky hits the top of the ship, the deck, but the sides are almost always in their own shadow. The sea, meanwhile, reflects the sky. So, you have a dark object, the ship's hull, viewed against a brighter background, the sea and sky. This is why ships are so easy to spot, especially at dawn and dusk, the most dangerous times for a convoy. This is the silhouette effect, and it was the U-boat commander's best friend. The British Directorate of Camouflage was filled with artists, designers, and scientists wrestling with this exact problem. They tried everything. They ran countless experiments with model ships in giant water tanks, using special lighting to simulate different times of day. They studied photographs. They interviewed sailors and escort commanders. But they kept coming back to the same impossible conclusion. As long as a ship cast a shadow, it would be visible. The conventional wisdom was that you had to make the ship look like the sea. But a small group of thinkers started to ask a radical question. What if everyone was looking at the problem the wrong way? What if the goal wasn't to blend in with the water below, but with the sky above? This line of thinking was inspired not by military tactics, but by the natural world. Zoologists had long known about a principle called countershading, or Thayer's law. It's why sharks and penguins are dark on top and light on their bellies. Seen from above, their dark backs blend in with the deep, dark water. Seen from below, their light bellies blend in with the bright, sunlit surface. This natural camouflage effectively cancels out shadow, making the animal seem flat and helping it disappear. Could the same principle be applied to a 10,000-ton steel ship? The idea was dismissed by many as absurd. But one man, a Canadian professor of zoology named Donald Kerr, who was working with the Royal Canadian Navy, took it seriously. He argued that the darkest part of a ship, the hull, needed to be made lighter, while the lightest parts, the deck and superstructure, should be made darker. The goal was to create a uniform, flat, neutral gray that had no shadows, no highlights, no form. A ship with no shape. But even this was just a refinement of existing ideas. The truly insane idea was yet to come. It was an idea that went against every instinct of a sailor trying to hide from a predator. The idea was simple, yet certifiably mad. To hide the ship, you had to light it up. The concept that would eventually lead to ships being made invisible was called, in its most extreme form, diffused lighting camouflage. The theory was both simple and mind-bendingly complex. It directly addressed the silhouette problem. If a ship appears as a dark shape because it's less bright than the sky behind it, the solution is obvious. You have to make the ship exactly as bright as the sky. And how do you make a dark object brighter? You shine lights on it. The proposal was to fit ships with a series of low-intensity projectors, mounted on outriggers along the hull and superstructure. These lights wouldn't be pointed out to sea. They would be pointed inwards, illuminating the ship's own surfaces. The intensity of these lights would be carefully controlled by a photoelectric cell. This cell would measure the brightness of the sky and automatically adjust the lights on the ship to match it perfectly. If the sky grew brighter, the lights would brighten. If a cloud passed over the sun, the lights would dim. The goal was to create a vessel that was, from an observer's point of view, emitting and reflecting the exact same amount of light as the background. In theory, if you got the balance exactly right, the ship would simply cease to exist. It would blend so perfectly with the horizon that the human eye, or the lens of a periscope, would be unable to distinguish it. It would be a true ghost ship. When this idea was first proposed to the hard-nosed traditionalist admirals at the Royal Navy, the reaction was predictable. Utter disbelief. You want to do what? Put lights on our ships? In a blackout? To hide them from U-boats that hunt at night? Have you gone completely mad? The idea seemed to violate every rule of naval warfare. For centuries, the first rule of hiding at night was to show no lights. A single lit cigarette on a deck could be seen for miles and bring a torpedo tearing through your hull. And these scientists were proposing to deliberately festoon ships with dozens of electric lamps. It sounded like a recipe for suicide. But the proponents of the idea, a mix of civilian scientists and a few forward-thinking naval officers, were persistent. They argued with charts and graphs, with light meter readings and mathematical formulas. They explained the physics of perception. A U-boat doesn't see a light, they argued. It sees a difference in brightness, a contrast. If you eliminate the contrast, you eliminate the target. The project was so secret and so strange, it was given the code name Yehudi, a Hebrew name of uncertain origin, perhaps chosen for its obscurity. The Americans were working on a parallel project for their aircraft, but the British were focused on their lifeline, the convoy ships. The technical challenges were immense. You needed projectors that were robust and waterproof, capable of surviving a North Atlantic gale. You needed a reliable power source. And most difficult of all, you needed a control system that was sensitive and responsive enough to match the ever-changing light of the sky. The first trials were conducted in secret, using small naval vessels. The initial results were mixed. It was incredibly difficult to get the lighting perfectly even. Dark spots and bright patches would appear, ruining the effect and sometimes making the ship even more conspicuous. The system was delicate and prone to failure. But there were moments, fleeting moments during twilight or on overcast days, where it worked. And when it worked, the effect was astonishing. Observers on other ships, knowing exactly where to look, would stare at the spot where the experimental vessel was supposed to be and see nothing. Just an empty patch of sea and sky. It was these moments of incredible success that kept the project alive. While the full-blown Yehudi lighting system was deemed too complex and fragile for mass deployment on rough and ready merchant ships, a much simpler, more elegant application of the same core principle was about to have its moment. It didn't rely on electricity, just on a deep understanding of light, and a very, very specific pot of paint. The color was, of all things, pink. The man most famously associated with the new, radical camouflage was not a scientist, but a charismatic and well-connected naval officer, Lord Louis Mountbatten. In 1940, while commanding a destroyer, he noticed something peculiar. One morning at dawn, he saw a ship from a convoy he was escorting. The ship was painted a shade of mauve gray, a standard Union Castle line color. To Mountbatten's surprise, this particular ship seemed to melt into the light of the dawn sky, disappearing far sooner than the other navy gray ships. It was just an observation, a fleeting moment, but it stuck with him. When he later became Chief of Combined Operations, he had the power and the resources to investigate his hunch. He remembered that disappearing ship. He commissioned experiments. The result was a very specific shade of light gray, mixed with a small amount of Venetian red. The resulting color was a pale, slightly purplish pink. It was officially designated Mountbatten pink. To the grizzled old sailors of the merchant navy, it was absurd. Painting a warship pink? It was an affront to naval tradition. They grumbled and joked about it. But the science behind it was sound. The red part of the light spectrum is the first to be scattered and absorbed as the sun rises or sets. This is why sunrises and sunsets often look red or pink. The sky itself takes on this hue. A ship painted in a conventional blue or gray would stand out as a dark, cool-colored silhouette against this warm, pinkish background. But a ship painted Mountbatten pink would absorb less of the red light and reflect it, causing it to blend in with its surroundings. It was a form of passive counterillumination. It wasn't designed to work in the bright light of midday or the pitch black of midnight. It was specifically designed for those critical, dangerous periods, dawn and dusk. This was when the sky was bright enough to silhouette a ship, but the light was still too poor for U-boat lookouts to see details clearly. This was the U-boat's favorite hunting time. Mountbatten was convinced. He had his own ship, the destroyer HMS Kelly, painted in this new color. The anecdotal evidence started to pour in. His ship seemed harder to spot. Other officers reported difficulty in keeping station with him during twilight maneuvers. It wasn't a cloak of invisibility, but it seemed to offer a genuine, tactical advantage. It reduced the range at which his ship could be reliably identified and targeted. In the deadly calculus of a torpedo attack, a few hundred yards of confusion or a few seconds of hesitation could be the difference between life and death. Simultaneously, other researchers were working on different colors for different conditions. They developed a scheme called the Western Approaches Scheme. The North Atlantic wasn't one uniform color. The light and the sea changed depending on the weather and time of day. So, they devised a system. The ship's hull would be painted a pale blue, almost white, color called Western Approaches Blue. This was to match the color of the sky near the horizon on a typical overcast day. The upperworks and superstructure would be a darker blue-gray, to blend in with the darker clouds and the sea itself. The idea was to break up the ship's solid, vertical mass. It was a more subtle, more scientific version of the old dazzle patterns. And then there was the simplest and perhaps most effective innovation of all, painting the ships white. This was the brainchild of a naturalist and naval officer, Peter Scott, the son of the famous Antarctic explorer. He argued that on the frequently overcast gray days of the North Atlantic, a white ship would be the least conspicuous. It would reflect the diffuse, gray light of the sky, making it incredibly hard to see. This went against the grain. White is normally a high-visibility color, but in the specific low-contrast environment of a North Atlantic winter, it was perfect camouflage. So now the Admiralty had a whole palette of strange, new colors. Mountbatten pink for the escorts at dawn and dusk. Western Approaches blue and white for the merchant ships in the daytime. These weren't just random guesses. They were the result of painstaking scientific research, of light meters, color theory, and endless observation. The stage was set to turn the entire Atlantic convoy system into a massive, floating optical illusion. Getting a radical new idea accepted by a deeply traditional institution like the Royal Navy is like trying to turn a battleship with a canoe paddle. It's a slow, frustrating process. The proponents of the new camouflage schemes faced a wall of skepticism, inertia, and outright ridicule. The old guard, the battleship admirals, were men who believed in firepower and armor plating, not in clever tricks with paint. They saw camouflage as a frivolous distraction, something for artists and academics, not for serious fighting men. Their attitude was, a ship is a weapon of war. It should look like one. Paint it gray and have done with it. The files in the Admiralty were filled with memos and counter-memos, arguments for and against the new schemes. Scientists would present carefully prepared papers with photometric data and sighting range calculations. In response, a crusty old captain would write a scathing report based on his 30 years of experience at sea, declaring that pink ships were an absurdity, and that a good lookout could spot anything if he was paying attention. There was also a significant logistical challenge. Paint was a strategic resource. The pigments, oils, and chemicals needed to make thousands upon thousands of gallons of marine paint were also needed for aircraft, tanks, and other military equipment. Launching a massive program to repaint hundreds of ships in new, experimental colors required a huge allocation of these precious resources. Was it worth it? Could they prove definitively that this would save ships? Proving it was the hardest part. The ocean is a massive, chaotic place. A ship might survive a crossing because of its camouflage, or it might survive because of good luck, bad weather that kept the U-boats down, or the skill of its escort commanders. A ship might be sunk despite its camouflage. It was impossible to conduct a truly controlled scientific experiment. You couldn't send out two identical convoys, one camouflaged and one not, and see which one suffered more losses. The stakes were too high. The debate raged for months in the corridors of power in London. Mountbatten used his considerable influence and royal connections to champion his pink paint. The scientists from the Directorate of Camouflage lobbied anyone who would listen, showing them photographs and models that demonstrated the startling effectiveness of the theories. They told stories from the early, secret trials. Stories of patrol boats that passed within a mile of a camouflage test ship without ever seeing it. Stories of experienced lookouts staring through powerful binoculars at an empty sea, while the target sat right in front of them, hidden in plain sight. One of the key figures who helped turn the tide was Commander Ian Fleming, the man who would later create James Bond. At the time, he was a key aide to the Director of Naval Intelligence. Fleming was a man who understood the value of deception, subterfuge, and unconventional thinking. He and his department were great supporters of any scheme, no matter how outlandish, that could give the Allies an edge. They understood that warfare wasn't just about steel and explosives. It was also about perception and psychology. If the new camouflage could plant a seed of doubt in a U-boat commander's mind, make him hesitate for a crucial second, or cause him to misjudge a range, then it was worth its weight in gold. Slowly, painstakingly, the evidence and the arguments began to win out. The sheer desperation of the situation in the Atlantic helped. With losses mounting at an astronomical rate, the Admiralty was finally willing to try anything. The order was given. The grand experiment was to begin. Shipyards from Liverpool to Halifax were sent new instructions, new paint formulas, and diagrams showing how the new, bizarre patterns were to be applied. The age of the ghost ships was about to dawn. For the crews of the merchant ships and their naval escorts, the new orders were bewildering. One day, they were docked, their ship a familiar, respectable navy gray. The next, dockyard workers were swarming all over it with paint rollers and spray guns, covering it in bizarre pastel shades. Imagine being a merchant seaman, already on edge about the perilous journey ahead, and watching your ship, your home, being painted a color you'd expect to see in a nursery. The jokes and the gallows humor were endless. Crews on Mountbatten pink destroyers called their vessels the Pink Panther, or the Corset. They felt ridiculous. They were hardened sailors, not debutantes going to a ball. There was a genuine fear that these bright colors would make them more visible, not less. The traditional maritime wisdom was gray for the sea, blue for the sky. Pink just seemed insane, but orders were orders. And as the newly painted ships put to sea, strange things started to happen. Captains of escort vessels began to complain in their logs. They were having trouble keeping track of the ships in their own convoys. A freighter, painted in the Western Approaches scheme, with its pale blue and white panels, would simply vanish against a cloudy sky. A captain would scan the horizon for his flock and find one was missing, only for it to reappear minutes later as the light changed. Station keeping, the vital and difficult task of keeping every ship in its assigned position in the convoy grid, became a nightmare. This was doubly true in rough weather or fog. While this was frustrating for the escort commanders, it was also the first real proof that the camouflage was working. If their own trained lookouts were having trouble seeing the ships, then it stood to reason that a U-boat commander, peering through a periscope that was constantly being washed over by waves, would have an even harder time. The stories from the sailors themselves began to change from ridicule to grudging respect. A lookout on a corvette would swear he saw a merchantman get hit by a torpedo, only to see the ship sail on unharmed. The explosion having been a torpedo detonating at the end of its run. Having missed a target, the lookout couldn't even properly see. A crew on a white-painted freighter would watch, hearts in their throats, as a U-boat surfaced a few miles away, scanned the horizon with binoculars, and then submerged again, having apparently seen nothing. These were small, anecdotal victories, but they added up. They created a sense of hope, a feeling that they weren't just helpless targets anymore. They had a secret weapon. It wasn't a gun or a depth charge. It was a bucket of paint and a clever idea. For the men on the Mountbatten Pink escorts, the proof came at dawn and dusk. They would conduct drills, with one ship steaming away from the others. And just as the scientists had predicted, as the sun dipped towards the horizon, the Pink destroyer would be the last ship to remain visible. It clung to the light, staying visible to its friends long after the gray ships had become black silhouettes. But for an attacking U-boat, the effect was the opposite. The Pink ship didn't become a silhouette. It just faded. It merged with the ambient glow of the twilight sky, denying the U-boat the crisp, hard target it needed. The transition from skepticism to belief was gradual, but it was real. The sailors might not have understood the physics of light scattering and counter-illumination, but they understood results. They were seeing it with their own eyes. Their oddly colored ships were harder to see, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough to get them home. To truly grasp the impact of this visual deception, we need to go back under the waves, back into the cramped, foul-smelling confines of a German U-boat. Let's put ourselves in the shoes of a young watch officer. Let's call him Klaus. He's 20 years old. It's his first patrol. He has been trained by the best. He knows how to use the optics, how to spot the telltale signs of a convoy. A smudge of smoke on the horizon, the tip of a mast. His eyes are sharp, and he is eager to prove himself to his veteran captain. For 12 hours a day, he stands on the U-boat's small, wet bridge, lashed by wind and spray, sweeping the horizon with his powerful, gyro-stabilized binoculars. The routine is monotonous, mind-numbing, gray sea, gray sky, endlessly. But his training keeps him alert. Look for anything that breaks the pattern. Then, one afternoon he sees it. A flicker of movement. He raises his glasses. Nothing. He scans again. There. A shape. But it's wrong. It's not the solid, dark form of a ship he was taught to look for. It's a pale, ghostly shape. It appears for a second, then vanishes. Is he seeing things? Is the sea spray playing tricks on his eyes? He doesn't want to raise a false alarm and look like a fool. He waits. He stares at the patch of ocean where he saw the shape. And there it is again. A pale blue and white form, shimmering in and out of existence. It's a ship, he's sure of it now. But it's like no ship he has ever seen. It looks like a cloud that has fallen onto the sea. He calls the captain to the bridge. The captain, a seasoned veteran of a dozen patrols, takes the glasses. He stares for a long time. He grunts. He has been hearing rumors on the radio from other U-boat commanders. Rumors of ghost ships, of convoys that appear out of nowhere, of targets that fade away just as you're about to fire. He had dismissed them as excuses for incompetence or the ramblings of crews suffering from combat fatigue. But now, he sees it for himself. The ship is real. He can just make out its masts and funnel. But its hull keeps blending into the sea and sky. It's an optical illusion that makes his head hurt. The order is given. Alarm! The U-boat dives. Now the hunt begins in earnest. At the periscope, the captain faces the same problem. The target is maddeningly indistinct. The range-finding equipment in his periscope relies on measuring the apparent height of the ship's mast against a graticule in the lens. But the ship is so pale, the top of its mast is almost impossible to distinguish from the overcast sky. His calculations are based on guesswork. His other tool is the sound detector. The hydrophones can hear the convoy, the rhythmic thumping of thousands of horsepower driving propellers through the water. The sound is real, but the visual is a mirage. As dusk approaches, things get even worse for the U-boat crew. They are stalking an escort vessel on the edge of the convoy. It's a destroyer, and it's painted a bizarre pale pink. As the sun sets, the western sky glows red, and the destroyer simply vanishes. It doesn't sink. It doesn't steam away. It just dissolves into the twilight glow. The U-boat captain knows it's still there. His hydrophones can hear its propellers, but he can't see it. He can't get a firing solution. He can't attack what he can't see. For the U-boat crew, this was a new and terrifying form of warfare. It was psychological. Their greatest weapon had always been their eyes, their ability to see the enemy when the enemy couldn't see them. Now, the Allies were stealing that advantage. The sea, once their perfect hunting ground, was now filled with phantoms. The confidence of the wolf packs began to erode, replaced by confusion, frustration, and a growing sense of dread. The ghost ships were real, and they were fighting back in a way no one had ever expected. The introduction of the new camouflage schemes did not happen in a vacuum. It was part of a much larger, rapid evolution in anti-submarine warfare. By mid-1943, the tide was turning in the Battle of the Atlantic, and the ghost ships were just one piece of a complex and deadly puzzle. The camouflage was the subtle player, the one that worked on the enemy's mind, but it was supported by a host of new, aggressive technologies. First, there was radar. Shipborne radar, particularly the new microwave-based Type 271, was a game-changer. It could detect a surfaced U-boat from miles away, even in pitch darkness or thick fog. A U-boat commander, who thought he was safely hidden on the surface at night, would suddenly find a British corvette charging out of the blackness, its searchlight blinding him as the guns opened up. The Germans developed a radar detector, the METOX, which could pick up the older radar signals, giving the U-boat a warning. But the new microwave radar was on a frequency the METOX couldn't detect. For the U-boats, the night was no longer safe. Then, there was air power. The Allies finally closed the Atlantic Gap, the area in the mid-Atlantic that had been out of range of land-based aircraft. New, very long-range B-24 Liberator bombers, equipped with their own powerful radar, began to patrol these desolate waters. For a U-boat, the sight of a four-engine bomber appearing over the horizon was a death sentence. And these aircraft were also camouflaged. Applying the same principles as the ships, their undersides were painted white or sky blue, making them incredibly difficult for a lookout on a U-boat's bridge to spot against the bright, overcast sky until it was too late. Weapons technology was also leaping forward. The Hedgehog was a new, forward-throwing anti-submarine mortar. Unlike traditional depth charges, which were dropped off the stern and exploded at a preset depth, the Hedgehog fired a pattern of 24 small bombs ahead of the ship. They only exploded on contact. This was far more lethal. An escort no longer had to sail over the top of a U-boat to attack it. It could attack while still maintaining ASDIC sonar contact. The camouflage worked in perfect concert with these other technologies. For instance, a U-boat might be forced to spend more time submerged because of the threat from the air. This meant it was slower, and its batteries were running down. It would have to surface at night to recharge and get ahead of the convoy for an attack. But at night, the new shipborne radar was waiting for it. The U-boat commander's job became an impossible series of tactical dilemmas. But where camouflage played its most unique role was in the attack itself. Let's say a U-boat managed to evade the aircraft and the radar patrols. It has slipped inside the convoy's defensive screen. It has a target in its sights. But the target is one of the ghost ships. The commander's range estimate is off by a few hundred yards because of the poor visual. His speed estimate is wrong because the ship's shape is confusing. He fires his torpedo. Because of these small errors, the torpedo passes harmlessly a few feet behind the ship's stern. Before he can correct and fire again, one of the Mountbatten pink escorts, which he never even saw in the twilight, is suddenly upon him, its Aztec dome pinging, its hedgehog ready to fire. The camouflage didn't sink U-boats, but it made them miss. And in the brutal arithmetic of the Atlantic, a miss was as good as a kill. It saved the ship, its crew, and its vital cargo. It frustrated the U-boat commander, wasted his precious torpedoes, and exposed him to counterattack. It was a soft weapon in a hard war, a weapon of light and shadow that tipped the scales in a dozen small ways, which, when added together, spelled disaster for Dönitz's wolf packs. On the other side of the English Channel, at the headquarters of the Befehlshaber der U-Boote, BDU, or U-Boat Command, in Lorient, Admiral Karl Dönitz and his staff were facing a crisis. For years, their men had been the undisputed masters of the Atlantic. Now, suddenly, the hunters were becoming the hunted. The reports flooding in from his U-boat commanders at sea were increasingly desperate and confused. The tone had changed from arrogant confidence to one of frustration and fear. Dönitz's staff meticulously analyzed every patrol report, every logbook, every radio transmission, looking for patterns, trying to understand what had gone so wrong. The new Allied technologies were obvious threats. They could identify radar signals and captured equipment. They knew about the hedgehog from survivors' accounts. These were tangible things, pieces of engineering that could be studied and, hopefully, countered. The Germans were brilliant engineers, and they immediately set to work on new radar detectors, on acoustic homing torpedoes, and on the Schnorkel, a device that would allow U-boats to run their diesel engines while submerged. But the reports of ghost ships were something else entirely. They were harder to quantify. How do you counter an optical illusion? The initial reaction from the BDU staff was skepticism. They were military men, pragmatists. They believed in steel, not shadows. They attributed the reports to the immense strain their crews were under. Fatigue, poor visibility, the constant fear of attack. All of these could lead to mistakes, to tricks of the eye. Some commanders were accused of cowardice, of inventing excuses for their failure to sink ships. A captain who reported missing a target because it faded away might find himself facing a hostile debriefing upon his return to base. But the reports kept coming, and they came from their best men, their most decorated aces. Men whose skill and courage were beyond question. They all told the same story, of ships that were hard to see, that lacked a clear silhouette, that melted into the horizon. Slowly, the German command began to realize they were facing a deliberate, systematic campaign of visual deception. German intelligence tried to piece together the puzzle. Spies in British ports reported on the strange new paint jobs. Reconnaissance aircraft took high-altitude photographs of convoys, which were then analyzed by photo interpreters. They could see the bizarre patterns, the pastel colors. They understood that it was some form of camouflage, but they struggled to grasp the scientific principles behind it. Their own camouflage efforts were largely focused on traditional, disruptive patterns designed to break up a ship's outline. The idea of matching a ship's brightness to the sky, counter-illumination, was a concept that seemed alien to them, almost magical. The psychological impact on the U-boat force was profound. The sea was no longer a predictable environment. Their own eyes, the most trusted tool of any sailor, could no longer be relied upon. This uncertainty created hesitation. A U-boat commander might delay his attack, waiting for a better view, a clearer silhouette. But in the mid-Atlantic of 1943, hesitation was fatal. That extra minute of delay was all the time an escort needed to get a radar fix, or for a liberator to appear out of the clouds. The camouflage, therefore, had a multiplier effect on all the other Allied advantages. It made the U-boat's job harder and more dangerous, which in turn gave the Allied technological and numerical superiority more opportunities to come into play. Dönitz urged his men to press on, to rely on their hydrophones, to attack with more aggression. But the confidence of the Wolfpacks was broken. May 1943, known as Black May to the U-boat arm, was the turning point. In that 1 month, the Allies sank 41 U-boats, a catastrophic and unsustainable loss rate. In return, the U-boats sank fewer ships than in any month since the war began. For the first time, Dönitz was forced to withdraw his forces from the North Atlantic. The Battle of the Atlantic was not over, but the ghost ships and their technological guardians had won a decisive victory. The strategic use of this new form of naval camouflage was a masterclass in applying a niche scientific principle to a massive industrial and military problem. The goal was not just to save one ship, but to protect the entire convoy system, the arterial lifeline that connected the industrial might of the United States with the front lines in Britain and Europe. The strategy was multi-layered. First, there was the choice of which ships to paint. It was impossible to repaint every single Allied merchant ship overnight. Priority was given to the ships in the most dangerous roles. The escort vessels, the destroyers, corvettes, and frigates, were often the first to receive the new paint, particularly Mountbatten pink. The logic was clear. If the U-boat can't see the sheepdog, it has a harder time attacking the flock. Furthermore, a less visible escort was a more effective hunter. It could close the distance to a surfaced U-boat at twilight without being spotted, turning the tables on the predator. For the merchant ships themselves, the application was also strategic. The ships on the outer columns of the convoy, the ones most exposed to attack, were more likely to be painted in the western approaches or all-white schemes. The ships in the center of the convoy, already shielded by their neighbors, were a lower priority. Tankers, carrying the most volatile and precious cargo of aviation fuel and gasoline, were given special attention. The loss of a single tanker could be more damaging than the loss of 3 freighters carrying dry goods. The strategy also varied by season and route. The pure white schemes, championed by Peter Scott, were found to be most effective during the winter months in the North Atlantic, when the weather was characterized by persistent, low, gray overcast skies. In the sunnier, clearer conditions of the Mediterranean or the Caribbean, other color schemes were more effective. The Camouflage Directorate produced detailed manuals and color charts for different theaters of war, a testament to the scientific rigor of the program. There was also a strategic element of deception and misinformation. The Allies did not want the Germans to fully understand the principles behind the camouflage. If the Germans knew that the goal was to match the brightness of the sky, they could potentially develop new optical filters for their periscopes to enhance contrast and defeat the illusion. So, the variety of schemes was, in itself, a form of confusion. To a German intelligence analyst, looking at photos of ships painted pink, white, pale blue, and in multicolored patterns, it wasn't immediately obvious that a single, unifying principle was at work. It just looked like the British were throwing everything at the wall to see what stuck. This prevented the Germans from developing a single, effective countermeasure. Perhaps the most important strategic impact was on resource allocation. Every ship that was saved by camouflage was a ship that did not need to be replaced. Every ton of cargo that got through was a ton that didn't need to be produced and shipped again. Every experienced merchant seaman who survived a voyage was one who could sail again. The camouflage, which was, in essence, just a few tons of paint and a clever idea, had a strategic return on investment that was off the charts. It reduced the strain on Allied shipyards, factories, and manpower, freeing up those resources for other vital tasks, like building landing craft for the invasion of Normandy. It was a force multiplier in the truest sense of the term, making the entire convoy system more efficient and resilient at a remarkably low cost. The decision to implement the new camouflage schemes across the vast Allied merchant and naval fleets was not a small one. It triggered a massive industrial and logistical effort that stretched from chemical plants in the American Midwest to shipyards on the River Clyde in Scotland. This was not just a matter of buying a few cans of paint from the local hardware store. The specific colors had to be precise. A shade of blue that was slightly too dark, or a pink that had a fraction too much red, would ruin the effect. The Directorate of Camouflage worked closely with paint manufacturers like ICI in Britain to create exact formulas. These weren't just colors, they were advanced coatings. They had to be durable enough to withstand the corrosive effects of salt water, the scouring of Atlantic gales, and the extreme temperature changes. They had to be easy to apply by shipyard workers, who were already overworked and under pressure. Thousands upon thousands of pages of specifications were drawn up. Color swatches, mixing instructions, and detailed diagrams were sent under high security to every major Allied port. The diagrams were crucial. The Western Approaches scheme, for example, wasn't just a random pattern. The placement of the different colored panels was scientifically designed to break up the key recognition features of a ship: the sharp line between the hull and the water, the vertical shapes of the funnel and the bridge, and the long, horizontal line of the deck. Shipyard managers, already struggling to meet deadlines for repairing battle-damaged ships and building new ones, now had to incorporate a whole, new, complicated step into their workflow. A ship would come in for refitting, and a specialized team of painters would descend on it. They would work from the detailed plans, meticulously masking off areas and applying the different shades. The sheer scale of the operation was staggering. Consider a single 10,000-ton freighter. It has a surface area of tens of thousands of square feet. Repainting it required hundreds of gallons of specialized paint. Now, multiply that by the hundreds of ships that made up the Atlantic lifeline. The demand for certain key chemical components, like titanium dioxide for white paint and iron oxides for the reds, skyrocketed. These materials had to be sourced, processed, and transported, all while a war was raging. This unsung industrial effort was the backbone of the entire camouflage strategy. The heroes of this story were not just the scientists and the sailors, but also the chemists in their labs, the workers in the paint factories, and the painters hanging from scaffolding in a cold, windswept shipyard, meticulously applying the colors that would turn a ship into a ghost. There was also a significant training component. Naval officers, escort commanders, and even ordinary lookouts had to be re-educated. For years, they had been trained to look for certain shapes, certain silhouettes. Now, they had to be taught what their own ships would look like, to prevent friendly fire incidents, and to manage the new difficulties of convoy station keeping. Recognition manuals were updated with new illustrations showing the camouflaged ships in different light conditions. The entire visual language of the war at sea was being rewritten, one paint scheme at a time. This massive, coordinated effort, from the research lab to the factory floor to the shipyard, demonstrates that the crazy idea was far more than just a flash of inspiration. It was a fully realized, scientifically managed, and industrially supported weapon of war. So, did it actually work? This is the crucial question. In the fog of war, it's often difficult to isolate one factor and definitively measure its impact. The victory in the Battle of the Atlantic in mid-1943 was the result of a convergence of many factors: superior intelligence from code breaking, the closing of the air gap, new radar and sonar technology, and new weapons like the Hedgehog. The camouflage schemes were just one of those factors. However, the evidence, both statistical and anecdotal, is compelling. The British Admiralty conducted its own analysis. They compared the loss rates of ships painted in the new camouflage schemes with those still painted in older, monochrome gray. The results were striking. A report from late 1943 concluded that a ship painted in the Western Approaches scheme was significantly less likely to be attacked, and if attacked, was less likely to be hit. The all-white ships proved to be the most successful of all, showing a marked decrease in visibility in the specific weather conditions of the North Atlantic. One study estimated that the camouflage reduced a ship's visibility by as much as 20% and made it 50% harder for a U-boat commander to accurately estimate its range and course. In a duel where seconds and yards mattered, these percentages were huge. The numbers from the other side tell a similar story. The catastrophic German U-boat losses in Black May of 1943, which forced Dönitz to temporarily withdraw from the North Atlantic, coincide almost perfectly with the period when the new camouflage schemes were being widely adopted, alongside the other new technologies. The U-boat commander's own logs and post-war testimonies are filled with complaints about the difficulty of spotting targets. They frequently mention bad visibility and poor conditions, even when the weather was objectively clear. This suggests that the camouflage was having a real, tangible effect on their ability to prosecute attacks. It was messing with their perception, making their job harder and more stressful. The psychological impact cannot be overstated. For Allied merchant seamen, the strange paint jobs became a badge of honor, a sign that the boffins back home were looking out for them. It gave them a sense of agency, a feeling that they were not just sitting ducks. Morale, a fragile but vital component of any military force, was boosted. Conversely, for the U-boat crews, it created an atmosphere of uncertainty and paranoia. Every U-boat that returned to base brought back more stories of ghost ships and missed opportunities. This narrative of an enemy who could disappear at will was deeply demoralizing. Of course, the camouflage was not a magic cloak of invisibility. Camouflage ships were still sunk. It was not a silver bullet. But warfare is not about silver bullets. It's about accumulating small advantages. It's about tipping the scales, ever so slightly, in your favor. The camouflage was a crucial thumb on the scales for the Allies. It bought them time. It saved lives, ships, and cargo. It worked in synergy with every other technological and tactical improvement. It was a quiet, subtle, and often overlooked contributor to one of the most important victories of the Second World War. The crazy idea of painting ships to look like the sky had been vindicated. Just as quickly as it had appeared, the era of the ghost ships began to fade. The very same force that made the camouflage necessary, technology, was also what would ultimately make it obsolete. The primary driver of this change was the rapid improvement and proliferation of radar. The early camouflage schemes were designed to fool the human eye. They were a brilliant solution to the problem of visual detection. But by 1944 and 1945, the war at sea was becoming less about what you could see and more about what you could detect with electronics. The Allies were fitting more and more of their ships and aircraft with advanced, high-frequency radar systems. These systems could paint a clear picture of a convoy on a cathode ray tube screen, regardless of the time of day, the weather, or what color the ships were painted. A U-boat commander could no longer rely on surfacing at night to gain a tactical advantage, because he would immediately appear as a bright blip on the radar screen of a nearby escort. The Germans, in turn, were also developing their own naval radar. And while it was never as effective or as widespread as the Allied systems, it signaled the future of naval warfare. When your primary detection method is bouncing radio waves off a steel hull, the color of that hull becomes largely irrelevant. A ship painted in the most brilliant camouflage would reflect a radar signal just as well as a ship painted bright orange. The arms race had moved from the visible spectrum into the radio spectrum. The game was no longer about light and shadow, but about pulses and echoes. As the threat of visual detection by U-boats receded, the strategic priorities for ship coloration changed. The need to hide from a periscope was replaced by another, equally pressing need: the need to be seen by friendly aircraft. As the Allies gained air supremacy over the Atlantic, one of the biggest dangers to a ship was being misidentified as an enemy vessel by an overeager friendly pilot. Therefore, new paint schemes were introduced with large, high-visibility markings on the decks and superstructures, aircraft recognition symbols. The very thing the old camouflage was designed to prevent, being conspicuous, was now a requirement. By the end of the war in 1945, the beautiful, scientifically designed camouflage of Mountbatten pink and Western Approaches blue was being painted over with functional, boring, uniform navy gray. The great experiment was over. The fleets of ghost ships returned to being solid, tangible vessels of steel. The brief, strange period when the oceans were filled with pink destroyers and pale blue freighters came to a close. The knowledge was not lost, but it was filed away, a curious chapter in the history of naval warfare. The lessons learned about deception, perception, and thinking outside the box would remain, but the specific application, the pots of paint, were consigned to the history books, made redundant by the relentless march of technology. The story of the ghost ships is more than just a quirky anecdote about pink paint. It's a powerful lesson in the nature of innovation, especially in times of crisis. It shows how a solution to a desperate problem can come from the most unexpected of places. It didn't come from the established naval architects or the ordnance experts. It came from zoologists studying animal coloration, from artists who understood the principles of light and color, and from maverick naval officers who were willing to listen to them. It is a testament to the power of interdisciplinary thinking. The Royal Navy's Directorate of Camouflage was a unique institution, a place where people with wildly different backgrounds could collaborate. A painter could have a conversation with a physicist, who could then talk to a naval commander. This fusion of art, science, and military pragmatism created an environment where a crazy idea like counter-illumination could not only be born, but could be tested, refined, and ultimately deployed on a massive scale. This story also highlights the importance of challenging conventional wisdom. For centuries, the unquestioned truth of naval warfare was that ships at night should be as dark as possible. The concept of deliberately lighting up a ship to hide it was so counterintuitive that it was almost dismissed out of hand. But the innovators behind the scheme were willing to question that fundamental assumption. They went back to first principles, to the physics of how the eye actually sees, and built their solution from there. It's a reminder that sometimes the most brilliant solution is the one that seems, at first glance, to be completely illogical. Furthermore, the legacy of the ghost ships can be seen in modern military technology. While the specific techniques of visual camouflage have been largely superseded by electronic warfare and stealth technology, the core principle remains exactly the same. The goal of a modern stealth aircraft like the F-22 Raptor or the B-2 bomber is not to be invisible to the naked eye. Its goal is to become invisible to radar. It achieves this through a combination of special shapes that deflect radar waves and radar-absorbent materials that soak up the radar energy. This is just a high-tech version of what the Western Approaches paint scheme was trying to do. Both are designed to manipulate the energy that an enemy uses to detect a target, be it light waves or radio waves, and to prevent that energy from returning to the detector. The principle of making an object blend in with its background by matching its signature is the direct intellectual descendant of the diffused lighting and counter-illumination projects of the Second World War. The ghost ships may have sailed into history, but their spirit lives on in the most advanced military hardware of the 21st century. To truly bring this story to life, we need to hear from the people who were there. Let's look at the words of Nicholas Monserrat, a naval officer who served on corvettes in the Battle of the Atlantic and later wrote the classic novel, The Cruel Sea. He wrote of the sheer, unending strain of the battle, the constant fear, and the brutal weather. He described the convoys as a flock of terrified sheep huddled together for comfort, while the wolves prowled round them in the darkness. His words paint a vivid picture of the terror the camouflage was designed to combat. In his log, he might have noted the strange appearance of a newly painted freighter. The Pride of Aberdeen rejoined us today from Halifax, looking like a great, pale ghost. The men are calling her the Spook. I must confess, she is devilishly hard to keep track of in the morning mist. Let us hope the U-boats find her equally troublesome. Now, let's cross the battle lines and read a translated excerpt from the war diary of a U-boat commander, someone like the fictional Klaus we imagined earlier. After a frustrating and unsuccessful patrol, he might have written, "For 14 days, we have seen nothing but phantoms. We sighted a large convoy on the 21st, but the visibility was atrocious. The ships had no clear outline. They appeared as pale smudges against the gray sea. We fired 4 torpedoes at what I judged to be a large tanker, but all missed. The escort, a destroyer, seemed to appear from nowhere at dusk. We were forced to dive and were depth-charged for 6 hours. The crew's morale is low. They are seeing ghost fleets everywhere. It is as if the British have found a way to bewitch the ocean itself." These personal accounts transform the story from a technical discussion of paint and light into a human drama. We can also look at the memoirs of the Boffins themselves. Peter Scott, the naturalist, painter, and naval officer, wrote extensively about his work on ship and aircraft camouflage. He described the endless experiments, the arguments with skeptical senior officers, and the immense satisfaction of finally seeing his theories put into practice. He wrote with the passion of an artist and the precision of a scientist, explaining how he used his knowledge of how birds camouflage themselves to hide a 10,000-ton ship. He recounted a test where he flew in an aircraft searching for a convoy. He knew exactly where it was, but for 20 minutes he could see nothing. Then, as the light changed, a whole fleet of 40 ships suddenly swam into view, like developing a photographic plate. These first-hand accounts are the soul of the story. They remind us that behind the grand strategy, the tonnage statistics, and the scientific principles, there were ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances. There were sailors shivering on watch, U-boat crews holding their breath in the depths, and scientists working late into the night, all playing their part in this strange and secret war of perception. Why isn't this story more famous? Why, when we think of the Second World War's secret weapons, do our minds jump to the Enigma machine, the bouncing bomb, or the Manhattan Project, but not to Mountbatten Pink? There are several reasons for its relative obscurity. First and foremost, its success was subtle and difficult to measure. The breaking of the Enigma code led to clear, dramatic victories, like the Battle of Cape Matapan or the sinking of the Bismarck. You could draw a direct line from the intelligence to the outcome. The bouncing bomb had a single, spectacular night of action in the Dambusters raid. The atomic bomb ended the war with 2 terrifying exclamation points. The success of the ghost ship camouflage was, by its very nature, a non-event. Its victories were the torpedoes that were never fired, the attacks that never happened, the ships that didn't sink. It's much harder to build a compelling narrative around something that prevented a disaster than it is to tell the story of a dramatic success. History remembers the bang, not the whimper that was avoided. Secondly, the camouflage was a temporary solution, quickly made obsolete by technology. Its heyday was relatively short, primarily the crucial period from late 1942 to early 1944. As radar became the dominant form of detection, the visual camouflage became a secondary, almost quaint consideration. The stories that endure through history are often those of technologies that changed the very nature of warfare for decades to come, like the aircraft carrier or the nuclear submarine. The ghost ship camouflage, for all its brilliance, was a tactical fix for a specific problem at a specific time. Thirdly, it lacked a single, heroic public face. The Enigma story has Alan Turing. The bouncing bomb has Barnes Wallis. The American atomic bomb project has Oppenheimer and Groves. The camouflage project was the work of a diffuse committee of scientists, artists, and naval officers. While figures like Mountbatten and Peter Scott were involved, they are more famous for other achievements. There is no single inventor of the ghost ships for history to mythologize. Finally, the story was shrouded in secrecy during the war, and after the war, it just wasn't as exciting as stories about fighter planes and tank battles. It was a passive, defensive measure. It was about not being seen, not getting into a fight. In the grand, sweeping narrative of the Second World War, the quiet, clever story of the ghost ships was simply drowned out by the louder, more explosive tales of heroism in combat. And so, it remains a piece of hidden history, a fascinating footnote waiting to be rediscovered, a testament to the fact that sometimes the most effective weapon is the one the enemy never even sees. The ultimate triumph of the ghost ship camouflage was not measured in enemy ships sunk, but in friendly ships saved. Its contribution must be seen as part of the total victory in the Battle of the Atlantic. Let's look at the numbers. In March of 1943, the peak of the U-boat success, over 600,000 tons of Allied shipping were sunk. By June of that same year, just 3 months later, that number had plummeted to under 100,000 tons. This dramatic turnaround was the result of the convergence of all the new Allied tactics and technologies, and the camouflage was a key part of that system. Every ship that made it to Britain was a small victory. A single freighter could carry enough food to feed 250,000 people for a week. Or it could carry 200 tanks, or 3,000 tons of explosives. A single tanker could carry enough aviation fuel for 1,000 bomber sorties over Germany. The camouflage, by increasing the chances of that ship getting through, had a direct impact on every other aspect of the Allied war effort. It fed the civilians, armed the soldiers, and fueled the air forces. Without the steady flow of supplies across the Atlantic, Britain would have been starved into submission. There could have been no buildup of American forces and equipment in the UK. And without that buildup, the D-Day landings in 1944, the liberation of France, and the final defeat of Nazi Germany would have been impossible. The Battle of the Atlantic was the foundational battle of the war for the Western Allies. Every other battle depended on it, and the camouflage schemes were a critical, if unsung, weapon in that foundational fight. Consider the human cost. It is estimated that around 30,000 Allied merchant seamen lost their lives in the Battle of the Atlantic. Every U-boat attack that was thwarted by the camouflage, every torpedo that missed its ghostly target, meant a crew of 40 or 50 men were spared a horrific death in the freezing, oil-slicked water. We can never know the exact number of lives saved by a clever application of paint, but it is certainly in the thousands, perhaps even tens of thousands. This, perhaps, is its most important legacy. It was a weapon that saved lives rather than taking them. It was a triumph of ingenuity over brute force, of intellect over aggression. In a war defined by its unprecedented violence and destruction, the story of the ghost ships is a rare and welcome tale of a clever, almost gentle idea that made a powerful and life-saving difference. It was the quiet genius that helped win the loudest war in history. Let's imagine it is early 1943, and we are on the bridge of a Royal Navy corvette, HMS Dianthus. The captain is a young lieutenant commander, only 25 years old, but with eyes that have seen too much. His ship is a tiny, 900-ton vessel, rolling violently in the Atlantic swell. It is brutally uncomfortable, constantly wet, and hopelessly outmatched by the submarines it hunts. His job is to protect a vast, slow-moving convoy of 60 merchant ships, a city-sized collection of targets spread over 20 square miles of ocean. For 3 days, they have been shadowed by a wolf pack. They know it. The tension is unbearable. Every lookout scans the gray waves, their eyes raw from the wind and the salt spray. Every sonar operator listens intently, trying to distinguish the ping of his ASDIC from the groans of his own ship's hull. At dusk, the attack comes. A freighter on the port side erupts in a column of flame and water. The alarm bells shriek. The captain barks orders, wheeling his little ship towards the threat. Another ship is hit, and another. The night is filled with explosions, the red glow of fires, and the frantic Morse code signals from stricken vessels. His job is not to rescue survivors. His job is to hunt. He pushes his crew and his ship to the limit, racing through the darkness, dropping depth charges on suspected contacts, firing star shells to illuminate the scene. But the U-boats are like phantoms. They strike and disappear. By dawn, the convoy is a wreck. 6 ships are gone, and the sea is littered with debris and life rafts. The captain is filled with a sense of impotent rage. This is the reality of the battle in early 1943. Now, let's fast forward just 6 months, to late 1943. The same captain, on the same ship. But things are different. His corvette is no longer gray. It is painted a jaunty Mountbatten pink. The merchant ships in his convoy are a patchwork of pale blue, white, and gray. He has a new radar set on his bridge, a green line sweeping around a circular screen, a magical eye that sees in the dark. His ship has been fitted with a hedgehog mortar on the bow. He is no longer just a sheepdog. He is a wolf hunter. A wolf pack tries to attack the convoy. But this time, the story is different. The U-boats struggle to find their targets in the twilight. Their periscopes see only hazy, indistinct shapes. A U-boat commander, frustrated, decides to risk a surface attack after dark. But the moment his conning tower breaks the surface, he appears as a blip on the captain's new radar screen. The little pink corvette turns instantly, charging towards the contact. The U-boat doesn't even see it coming. The first indication of danger is when a searchlight pins the submarine's bridge, followed by the terrifying whoosh of the Hedgehog bombs being fired. The bombs arc through the air and land around the U-boat, a series of sharp cracks, and the submarine is ripped apart. This time, at dawn, the convoy is intact, and it is the U-boat that is at the bottom of the sea. This tale of 2 convoys illustrates the dramatic shift that occurred in the Battle of the Atlantic. The ghost ship camouflage was not the sole author of this change, but it was an essential character in the story. It was the subtle enabler, the ghost in the machine that made all the other new weapons and tactics even more deadly. It helped turn the tide in the most important battle of the war. The development of the ghost ship camouflage was a secret war fought on a very unusual battlefield. It wasn't fought in the mud of the trenches or the skies over Europe. It was fought in quiet university laboratories, in giant water tanks at the Admiralty Research Station, and on the easels of painters. The soldiers in this war were an unlikely collection of characters who would have been more at home in a senior common room than on a battlefield. There were ornithologists who studied the plumage of birds, marine biologists who understood the way light penetrates water, and experimental psychologists who specialized in human perception. One of the key centers for this research was the Lymington Spa, a town in Warwickshire, where the naval section of the Directorate of Camouflage was based. Here, far from the sea, they built large pools where they floated precisely made-scale models of ships. Using sophisticated lighting rigs, they could simulate the light conditions of the North Atlantic at any time of day, in any weather. They would then observe these models through periscopes, testing hundreds of different paint schemes. They meticulously recorded their findings, creating a massive database of what worked and what didn't. They took photos. They measured light levels. They argued about color theory. It was a place of intense, creative, and sometimes eccentric scientific inquiry. There are wonderful anecdotes from this period. Stories of distinguished professors lying on their stomachs for hours, peering through a periscope at a tiny toy ship. Stories of artists getting into heated debates with naval commanders about the precise shade of blue required to match a winter sky. One of the leading figures, the biologist Hugh Cott, even proposed a scheme that involved painting a false bow wave on the ship to confuse U-boat commanders about its speed. Another idea was to use angled mirrors on the superstructure to reflect the sea and sky. Most of these ideas were too impractical for mass production, but they show the incredible, out-of-the-box thinking that was going on. This was a war of ideas, a competition of intellect. While German engineers were perfecting their torpedoes and diesel engines, these British scientists and artists were weaponizing the laws of optics. They understood something profound, that the most powerful weapon in the world is the human mind, and the easiest target to fool is the human eye. They couldn't make a 10,000-ton ship of steel truly invisible, but they could make an experienced U-boat commander doubt what he was seeing. And in the split-second world of a torpedo attack, a moment of doubt was all they needed. This secret war of the boffins was just as crucial as the more visible war being fought by the sailors on the high seas. The story of the ghost ships provides us with a fascinating window into the concept of asymmetric warfare. This is the idea that a weaker or less technologically advanced force can defeat a stronger one by using unconventional tactics, by changing the rules of the game. In early 1942, the Allies were, in many ways, the weaker force in the Atlantic. The U-boats had the tactical initiative. They could choose when and where to strike. They were the predators. The Allies were in a defensive, reactive posture. They couldn't afford a direct, symmetrical fight. They didn't have enough destroyers to hunt down and kill every U-boat, so they had to think asymmetrically. The camouflage scheme was a perfect example of this. It didn't try to meet the U-boat's strength with strength. It didn't try to outgun the U-boat. Instead, it attacked the U-boat's greatest weakness, its reliance on visual targeting. A U-boat was a formidable weapon system, but the entire system depended on one man, looking through one periscope, making a judgment based on what he could see. The camouflage didn't attack the submarine itself. It attacked the information that the submarine's commander received. It introduced noise, uncertainty, and doubt into his decision-making process. It was a form of information warfare, fought with paint instead of radio waves. This is a timeless principle of strategy. If your opponent is strong, don't attack him where he is strong. Find his weak point, his critical vulnerability, and attack that. The U-boat's strength was its stealth and its powerful torpedoes. Its weakness was its visual-based fire control system. The ghost ship camouflage was a weapon designed with surgical precision to exploit that single vulnerability. It also turned one of the Allies' own weaknesses, the sheer size and number of their slow merchant ships, into a kind of strength. It was impractical to make every merchant ship a formidable warship, but it was practical to repaint them. The camouflage program allowed the Allies to give a defensive capability to thousands of otherwise helpless vessels, at a minimal cost in time and resources. It was a brilliantly efficient, asymmetric solution to a seemingly insurmountable problem. It changed the rules of the engagement from a simple equation of firepower to a much more complex game of perception and deception. And in that new game, the Allies had the winning hand. While the British were pioneering schemes like Mountbatten Pink and Western approaches, The United States Navy was conducting its own fascinating series of experiments in ship camouflage. American thinking was heavily influenced by the vast, bright, and often sunny conditions of the Pacific Theater, which were very different from the gray gloom of the North Atlantic. One of the most famous American schemes was the Thayer system, based on the same principles of countershading that had inspired the British. In this scheme, the hull of a ship would be painted white, or a very light gray, to blend with the sky, while the decks and the tops of the gun turrets would be painted a dark blue-gray, to blend with the sea when seen from a high-flying enemy aircraft. This was particularly important for warships that might be targeted by Japanese dive bombers and torpedo planes. The Americans also experimented with some very complex, multicolored pattern schemes. Unlike the British schemes, which were mostly about reducing visibility, some of the American measure schemes were designed to confuse. They used bold, geometric patterns to break up the ship's outline and to create false bow waves or false shadows, making it hard for an enemy submarine or aircraft to judge the ship's speed and heading. The U.S. Navy even took the concept of diffused lighting camouflage a step further with the Yehudi Lights project. This was primarily an experiment for aircraft, not ships. The idea was to mount lights on the leading edges of a plane's wings and fuselage. A photoelectric cell would measure the brightness of the sky, and the lights would be adjusted to match it perfectly, making the aircraft incredibly difficult to see head-on. The system was tested on a B-24 Liberator and an Avenger torpedo bomber, and the results were astonishing. In tests, the camouflaged Avenger could approach a ship to within 2 miles before being spotted, whereas a standard, unlit plane was spotted at 12 miles. This was a huge advantage for a torpedo bomber. The project was ultimately canceled, not because it didn't work, but because by the time it was perfected, the war was ending, and the advent of better radar was seen as a more promising path for the future. This parallel development in the United States shows that the idea of radical, science-based camouflage was not just a British eccentricity. It was a concept that was being seriously explored by the best minds on both sides of the Atlantic. It was a secret, intellectual arms race, a competition to see who could master the art and science of invisibility. The story of the ghost ships is, at its heart, a story of human ingenuity in the face of adversity. It is a powerful reminder that the outcome of a war is not solely determined by the number of tanks, ships, or planes a country can produce. It is also determined by the quality of its ideas, by the creativity and audacity of its thinkers. In the darkest days of the Battle of the Atlantic, when it seemed that brute force was failing, it was a quiet, strange, and beautiful idea that helped turn the tide. An idea that drew its inspiration not from the battlefield, but from the natural world, from the way a penguin's white belly blends with the bright surface of the sea, from the way a snowshoe hare's white coat makes it disappear against the snow. The men who conceived of these camouflage schemes were warriors of a different kind. Their weapons were not guns, but paintbrushes and light meters. Their battlefield was not the blood-soaked beaches of Normandy, but the quiet laboratories of Leamington Spa. They did not win medals for valor in combat, but their contribution to the Allied victory was immense. They saved countless lives and billions of dollars worth of vital cargo. They helped to ensure that the lifeline to Britain remained open, making the eventual liberation of Europe possible. The next time you see a picture of a Second World War convoy, look closely at the ships. If you see one that looks strangely pale, or is painted in an odd patchwork of blue and white, you are looking at more than just an old photograph. You are looking at a ghost. You are looking at the physical embodiment of one of the cleverest, most counterintuitive, and most successful secret weapons of the entire war. A weapon born from the realization that sometimes the best way to fight an enemy is to convince him that you are not there at all. It is a story that proves that even in the midst of the most brutal conflict in human history, there is still room for elegance, for artistry, and for the kind of crazy idea that just might change the world. Let's zoom in on one specific, crucial battle, where this confluence of new technologies and tactics came together. The battle for Convoy ONS-5 in late April and early May of 1943. This is widely considered to be the turning point of the entire Battle of the Atlantic. ONS-5 was a slow convoy, 43 ships heading west from Britain to North America. It was protected by a small escort group, and it was sailing straight into the largest concentration of U-boats ever assembled for a single operation, more than 50 German submarines. For 10 days, a brutal, running battle raged across the North Atlantic. The weather was horrific, a full-scale gale that scattered the convoy and made life hell for everyone. In the first phase of the battle, things went badly for the Allies. The U-boats, using their pack tactics, sank 12 ships. It seemed like another convoy disaster was unfolding. But then, the new Allied advantages began to assert themselves. Very long-range aircraft, flying from Newfoundland and Iceland, appeared over the convoy. Some of these planes were equipped with radar and painted in the new anti-submarine camouflage, making them deadly U-boat hunters. The surface escorts were also equipped with the new, improved radar. They could see the U-boats on the surface at night, and many of the ships in the convoy and its escort were painted in the new visibility-reducing schemes. In the confused, storm-tossed conditions, the U-boat commanders found it incredibly difficult to pick out and identify their targets. The combination was lethal. An escort would get a radar contact. It would charge towards the U-boat, itself difficult to see in the gloom thanks to its paint job. The U-boat would be forced to dive. The escort would then use its improved ASDIC and its Hedgehog to hunt the submarine down. Over the course of the battle, the Allies sank 6 U-boats and damaged 7 more. The U-boat command, stunned by the ferocity and effectiveness of the defense, was forced to call off the attack. While 12 merchant ships were lost, the price the U-boats paid was too high. The exchange rate had turned decisively in the Allies' favor. ONS-5 was a victory won by a system. No single element was solely responsible. It was the aircraft, the radar, the Hedgehog, the skill of the escort crews, and the subtle, pervasive advantage conferred by the camouflage. It proved that the era of U-boat dominance was over. The wolf packs had been defeated, and the ghost ships had played their silent, crucial role in the victory. The psychological toll of the Battle of the Atlantic on the men in the U-boats was immense. In the early years of the war, they were the elite, the heroes of the Reich. They were feted in propaganda films, and their commanders became national celebrities. They felt invincible. But by 1943, that feeling was gone, replaced by a gnawing, persistent fear. The average life expectancy of a U-boat crewman was terrifyingly short. More than 75% of all Germans who served on U-boats did not survive the war, the highest casualty rate of any branch of the German armed forces. The introduction of the Allied camouflage schemes added a strange, almost supernatural element to this fear. Imagine you are a young German sailor. You spend weeks at a time in a cramped, smelly, steel tube under the ocean. Your world is one of gauges, levers, and the constant hum of machinery. Your only contact with the outside world is the view through the periscope or the brief, terrifying moments on the bridge. Now, that view becomes untrustworthy. You are told to look for ships, but the ships look like clouds. You are told to attack at dusk, but at dusk, the enemy destroyers seem to vanish into thin air. The rumors and sea stories spread through the U-boat bases in France. Tales of entire convoys that sailed through a U-boat patrol line without a single ship being sighted. Tales of torpedoes that passed straight through the hulls of phantom ships. Of course, these stories were exaggerations, the products of stress and fear. But they had a real psychological effect. They created a narrative of an enemy who was not just powerful, but clever, almost magical. This undermined the confidence and aggression that a submarine commander needed to be successful. It's one thing to face an enemy you can see. It's another thing entirely to fight an enemy who is playing tricks with your mind. This psychological warfare was an unintended but powerful side effect of the camouflage program. It complemented the physical destruction wrought by the new weapons. It attacked not just the U-boats, but the will of the men who crewed them. The war in the Atlantic was won not just when the Allies started sinking more U-boats, but when the U-boat crews themselves began to believe that the odds were insurmountable, that the ocean itself had been turned against them by a clever and unseen enemy. The ghost ships haunted their dreams as much as they haunted the sea lanes. So, what can we take away from this incredible story? What is the final lesson of the ghost ships of the Atlantic? It is a lesson that transcends its specific time and place. It is a story about the power of seeing the world differently. The admirals saw ships as weapons. The U-boat commanders saw them as targets. But a small group of artists and scientists saw them as canvases. They saw them not as solid objects, but as a collection of surfaces reflecting light. And by understanding this, they found a power that had been overlooked for centuries. They remind us that the most effective solutions are often not the most obvious ones. When faced with a problem, our instinct is often to meet force with more force. The Allies could have focused all their efforts on building more destroyers and more planes. And they did do that. But they also pursued a parallel path, a path of subtlety and deception. They understood that you could win a battle not just by overpowering your enemy, but by outthinking them. The legacy of Mountbatten Pink and the Western Approaches scheme is not just in the ships they saved or the battle they helped to win. It is in the mindset they represent. A mindset that is open to strange ideas, that values creativity as much as it values firepower, that is willing to challenge long-held assumptions, and that understands that the greatest battles are often fought in the 6 inches of space between our ears. The war was won by millions of people, by soldiers, sailors, airmen, and factory workers. But it was also won by the quiet, dedicated work of those who fought with different weapons, with knowledge, with insight, and with a humble pot of paint. They turned the cold, gray Atlantic into a gallery of optical illusions, and in doing so, they created a fleet of ghost ships that will sail forever in the pages of history, a silent testament to the simple, brilliant idea that changed the course of the war.